Now we're going to hear about many of those other organizations that are also engaged in this policy space, including community organizations, research institutions, universities, and others, and foundations as well. So there will be a lot of time for conversation, and like I said, towards the end of that, we would have a field trip information. I also need to talk to you about what's happening on Friday, and then we have a book run. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor John Kurian to come and as a chair of this session, and then all the speakers. The thing is, I don't know where my list is. This is becoming a habit that I'm losing my list. They are all here. I'm just gonna look at them one at a time. Pip, Jorge, Imani, Sebastian, and one more. Oh, Fabio. Yes, this is the last plenary. In the sense of the formal plenary session, we would have on Friday a little bit more, plenary session, but not with plenary speakers. This is my topic that I brought with me from Bangkok. So, not just put name and then we'll figure it out who wants to sit where. There's no real order anyway. Yes? Okay. So, let's welcome our panelists for this session.
Good morning, and thank you, Ratana. Thank you for providing the opportunity for chairing this session and for the session itself. We just heard from those who presumably make policy, and today, this session, we are going to listen to people who have the possibility to influence policy. And from my own experience, I know that policy influencing is an art, and it also calls for strategic ways of doing things, interventions, and it requires a lot of finesse. It cannot be done crudely and very blatantly. So we have individuals here who represent different streams of possibilities to influence policy, and we just through research or through funding or through lobbying, whatever, and we will listen to them. We don't have much time, so I'm going to minimize what I say and go directly to the speakers, and I could go by the list the way it is organized here. The first speaker is Sebastian Matthew. He is the Executive Secretary of the ICSF, the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers. He has a background in applied economics, and he's been an activist researcher for quite some years, from 1991, doing a lot of advocacy, lobbying at the UN, FAO, ILO, and supporting fish worker movements around the world. So, Sebastian.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I would like to comment on the title. I feel that when we talk about implementation of the small-scale fishery guidelines, we are not only talking about fisheries policies. So that is one important lesson that I have learned from the guidelines process, that there are various aspects, and we need to talk about multiple policies that have to be influenced. And in my short presentation, I will be highlighting what the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers has been doing. Firstly, I think I remember Swain was the same kind of making a very important observation day before, that the small-scale fishery guidelines are an important watershed for small-scale fishing communities. And similarly, some people would say that the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries is an important watershed in fisheries management. So therefore, we can see that the guidelines, in a way, completes what the code of conduct could not achieve in terms of, for example, if you look at disaster response, disaster risk assessment, I mean, these are the things which are missing from the code of conduct. But if you look at the guidelines, we see that these are very well covered and very important in the context of many cyclones and hurricanes happening all over the world. So therefore, interesting to see that the guidelines are talking about communities. And then the bedrock of the guidelines, as has been commented by several people, are the human rights approach, which is very important for everyone. And then I feel that it is addressed to a lot of people who are not really mentioned in the code of conduct, which is like the vulnerable and marginalized group, indigenous people. Then both marine and inland fishing communities. Therefore, there is a very strong focus on those who are actually marginalized and how do you mainstream them. And how do you mainstream them using human rights approach as a tool. So what ICSF is doing today, we have been involved in translating the guidelines into many languages. In fact, if you look at our website, you can see that many Indian languages, for example, are included in the translation. We have also translated a summary of the guidelines prepared by Professor Kurian, so that they're trying to take the information down to the local level. And then we are using these kind of instruments, trying to build awareness. And then along with material in translation, we are also trying to provide, is it clear now? Yeah. We're also trying to organize workshops to build capacity of national level fish worker organizations. And right now, ICSF is working in several countries in Latin America, in Africa, Asia, mainly with the idea of raising awareness and capacity building. And in this context, we would like to thank FAO for the support they are extending to us for a very extensive project in 9 countries for implementation. And then we also believe in forming partnerships with CSOs. So wherever we work very closely with national level organizations. For example, the work we are doing right now in Brazil is in Amazonia region to reach the guidelines to the inland fishing communities in the Amazonia, in the Amazon River. So the First Nations in that area will be actively participating in that workshop. And then we also try to, in addition to capacity building of the national level, local level organizations, we are also trying to influence fisheries policies. For example, to see if we can change the mindset of fisheries administration to look at issues which are non-traditional in a sense. So we have been engaging with some of the processes in relation to developing inland fishery policy, marine fishery policy, and to see whether one can try to develop action points for implementation of the guidelines. So these are some of the work we are doing. And then we are also trying to engage, in fact, ICSF perhaps is the first organization to bring the human rights commissions into our work. So in our first meeting in India in 2015, towards implementation, we had the Human Rights Commission of India participating actively in the workshop. And this has been now subsequently picked up by many others, and is a very good model to follow. And we feel that if we really have to influence the implementation, we have to also look at human rights commissions. We have to look at how we can influence a trade policy, for example. How can we influence gender policy at the national level? How can we influence the agriculture policy? For example, many countries, fisheries would be a subset of agriculture, so how do you influence those policies? Therefore, this kind of cross-cutting and kind of a transverse approach we really need to internalize and integrate into the implementation process. And then, last but not the least, we are also trying to use the WTO negotiations right now on fishery subsidies, because there are a couple of references to the guidelines in the draft text of the negotiation text. So there, we are trying to see if at the national level, countries can agree that the guidelines will be the framework to develop a national definition for small-scale fisheries. And then we also try to see how the Sustainable Development Goals, for us actually all the Sustainable Development Goals are relevant when we talk about the implementation of the guidelines. So we are trying to see how these two can be integrated, and then one can try to provide a normative framework for the other to be put into effect. So these are the kind of work we are doing. So I think when you talk about the challenges, I think the main problem we are facing is that the structure of the guidelines are kind of cross-cutting. So to bring that kind of focus, for example, for the fisheries department to talk about labor or decent work, ILO conventions, they will say, okay, it should be dealt with at the labor ministry. We will say, no, the fisheries department should take some interest in decent work issues, employment, conditions of work, rights at the workplace, social protection, social dialogue. All these issues are important. And how do you change the perspective of the labor administration to look at fisheries issues, to see that fisheries employment is not really as you see in industrial workplace. So therefore, there are a lot of issues in which we need to have some kind of a cross-sectoral dialogue and exchange of views. And so we also therefore try to see whether Labour Ministry, Trade Ministry, Fisheries Administration, Agriculture Administration all can change their gaze a little bit and look at this community, and then whether using human rights-based approach as a process we can really influence. And in this process, again, the National Human Rights Commission very actively present in producing the voluntary national reports. They report to the UN Human Rights Council. So those reports actually can have a section on the guidelines, because the guidelines make a specific reference to human rights. So therefore, again, this is a process in which we would like to see more interaction between civil society and national governments, so that we have some reporting process along with the reporting process used for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Sebastian. I hope you got the gist of what he was saying. The next speaker is Dr. Philippa Cohen. She represents the World Fish Center, and currently she is the program leader for the World Fish Resilient Small-Scale Fisheries Program. PIP, as she likes to be called, does a lot of research work on human well-being outcomes, particularly in the issues relating to good governance in fisheries and natural resources. And the main realm of work at the moment is Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Timor-Leste. So,
thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm very humbled to be sitting up here with this panel of very diverse speakers coming from different perspectives, and I think that's really valuable about this panel. Despite coming from very different perspectives, we're all sitting in front of some scrawled notes that look equally as messy as each other. You can't see that from there. But at the moment I'm going to start talking a little bit on behalf of World Fish, which is a research organisation, and how we view our role in kind of as policy influencers or potential policy influencers. So World Fish is a research organisation, but we, I guess, call ourselves a research for development or research in development organisation. And I guess there are three words that I think that describe or that are particular emphases on the way in which we do research. They're embedded, responsive and engaged. Embedded, I mean embedded in partnerships and place. So our organisation has country offices. Sitting in this room, we have representatives from Africa, Zambia, Tanzania and Malawi, where we have offices working quite a lot on small-scale fisheries. In Asia, we have offices in Bangladesh, Myanmar and Cambodia, and in the Pacific, we have an office in Solomon Islands. So embedded in partnerships and place, I think, is a critical aspect if research is to have any view on influencing or being a constructive part of policy. The second is responsive, and I think research really needs to be responsive to national and local priorities. I think it's very difficult to do that if you're not also embedded and continually in conversations with your partners. And also the third is engaged, and I mean engaged at different scales. So engaged with communities, working on very hands-on ways in which to manage fisheries, working at national levels, looking at policy, monitoring policy, and working at regional levels as well, where there are regional structures and mechanisms that might enable or disenable local actions. All of these three elements take a huge amount of time to do well. And this is a little bit challenging when you're a research organisation and you're also measured against research output of universities. But if you have any hope, I guess, of having any impact or appropriate influence in policy, then these investments are absolutely critical. I've spent a bit of time reflecting on, well, what is the role of research in this development space and with small-scale fisheries? Because we're not policymakers and we're not development practitioners. We're researchers with a view, to create an environment and innovations that enable small-scale fisheries values to persist and grow. So I guess as a researcher, we reflect on then what are three questions we might ask ourselves as researchers. There's an increasing emphasis within the research space that research should influence policy. I think this is an opportunity, and it also makes me a little bit nervous because, well, you're a researcher. So, you know, is policy the right space for you to be interacting in? So I think we need to ask ourselves as researchers, is your particular piece of research the priority or part of a bigger movement that should be influencing policy in the first instance? Was that research designed with and in response to the needs of policymakers and local people? So does it hold the legitimacy to actually influence policy? And are you a loud voice and a legitimate voice, speaking with the voices of others? And then the way in which this research, say it's done in a way that is embedded, it's legitimate, then how do we communicate that research to and with policymakers? And I think we need to kind of evolve in the way we've thought about communication, that we've thought about communicating research to policymakers. Yet it needs to be a much more embedded process and continuous process that that policymakers were a part of that research and were looking and seeking for that research in the first place. I'll finish, I think one of the important roles of research is increasing transparency and accountability towards existing policy commitments. It's a dense policy space out there. Do we need to be creating new policies? And in some places there is a policy void and we can play an active role. So for example, we have some work in Timor-Leste, which is a new governance regime. It's not a new country, but it's a new governance regime. And so there is a policy void. And so influencing policy, developing policy is the right kind of approach. But it's a dense policy space out there. If you saw Hugh Govern's presentation in a panel, he listed all of the policies that apply to small-scale fisheries in the Pacific. Do we need another policy? So one of the roles of research is increasing transparency and accountability to existing policies, including the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And also looking at small-scale fisheries as a sector in relation to other sectors. And this is a point that Sebastian touched on. I think we also, as fisheries researchers, as small-scale fisheries actors and supporters, need to get a bit more, reach out beyond our comfort zone and working a lot with other sectors. So for example, in our work in Cambodia and Myanmar, there's a lot of work with the water sector. And influencing the way in which water infrastructure and policy is designed and implemented as a huge opportunity for improving small-scale fisheries values. And also with the food sector. The nutritional values of fish in many cases are irreplaceable. So we need to move on from the talk about protein and talk about micronutrients. And then we're a legitimate voice in the nutrition and food security sector. So I think some opportunities, and I want to end on, I guess, that point of opportunity. Whilst we do need to talk about some of the challenges that small-scale fisheries face, I think if we're to be influential, where there's a lot of talk about growth, private sector investment, we really need to talk about how some of these opportunities and the opportunities to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals can be realised through and via small-scale fisheries. So shifting our language that small-scale fisheries and sustainable and resilient small-scale fisheries will help us deliver on the nutrition SDG. They're a vehicle through which gender equity can be realised, and they're a force through which to achieve sustainable resource use. Thanks.
Thank you, Pip. We'll next go to Dr. Jorge Torres. He is the General Director of Comunidad de Biodiversidad AC of Mexico. He has a very wide interest in environmental issues, conservation, biology, sustainable development, and he's done a lot of work in the marine reserve space, and he's going to talk a little bit about that from that perspective.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jorge. As just present me, I'm the General Director of NGO, Comunidad y Biodiversidad, COBI, this year. I'm going to present the perspective of an NGO, a national NGO, not international, not regional, but a national, or local. And a few years ago, we published a paper led by Maria Jose that's sitting there 2 years ago. We work with other NGOs, and we see that for the last 10 years, the role of NGOs are changing. The environmental NGOs, finally, we are getting that we want to manage people. We work with people. So we are moving from just don't touch, not touch, biodiversity, conserve, to be a bridge between different stakeholders, to accomplish a balance between environment but also well-being of the humans. COBI is we promote marine conservation, some fisheries, but with participation of the people. That is the key ingredient. We 2 years ago we start 3 years ago a process to use the sustainable fisheries, small-scale fisheries guidelines to evaluate our work. We have been here for almost 20 years, and the guidelines is a really good tool to evaluate your job. Are you doing something good, or you are completely lost? And I highly invite all the NGOs to do this exercise. Mainly any NGO, but also mainly the international NGOs, because there is a tendency that all the time big NGOs reinvent new stuff that help to confuse everybody. And the FOA, the guidelines, is a guidelines, it's the official, it's a channel that everybody can be aligned in that. So we did this analysis published in one of the books of the TBTI, chapter 20, and I will just mention really the key finds, like the guidelines about governance. As NGO, we were supporting that the cooperatives, the fishing organization have fishing rights, but all the time linked with sustainability. The guideline about sustainable resources management, we are promoting the use of international standards for sustainability, Marine Stewardship Council, Fair Trade, fisheries improvement projects, Monterrey Bay Aquarium, anyone. There are standards that are already there, and fishers are doing it. So the other is gender. I mean, we are just losing 50% of the voices the women are not sitting in the decision-making tables. So we are just losing 50% of the opinions, vision, and creativity, and as NGO we are promoting that has to be a priority. There are opportunities in the guidelines, and in the case of our NGO, but I think other ones, social development, employment, and decent work. That guideline is, I think not a lot of NGOs are doing a good job or doing something. And one great opportunity is to link sustainability with social benefit. Sustainability now is equal to you will receive more money in your pocket. And we need to see that sustainability is linked with social benefits for everybody. Value change for harvest, for post-harvest and trade. There is a big gap between the needs of the fishers and the needs of the markets. And there is a need still in a middleman. And there is opportunity to work with middlemen for sustainability. There is this dream that in some way NGOs were often saying if you fish right, you immediately receive more money. That is not happening, at least in developing countries. We all the time try to do a copy-paste of the US model and the European model. It's not happening. We need to be more creative. Climate change. Climate change is in our in the house, not even in the doors. Now, we are seeing as NGOs, we work in 19 communities in Mexico, and things are happening very fast. But is climate change, there are new paradigms, new threats. Climate change, international markets. If China wants to eat something, the whole markets in the world change. Technology, cheaper, better. Fishermen are using drones. Fishers are using drones, GPS. We did a study, 80% of 200 fishers that we interviewed use digital social media, Facebook. Please use Facebook, Twitter. Researchers and everybody is really behind that. Fishers are using social media a lot. International policies with the changes in the United States, changes happening at the local level. So there are new threats, also that. So one of the things is we need to be, I'm talking about policy, is between one thing that is important to do a new policy, a change, all the way to have a result in implementation in the field takes decades. Stop promising. NGOs, there is a lot of competition, and we tend to promise things that we're going to change the world with a bomb in a year, changing a policy. It's not true. Between the idea all the way to be implemented take years, and fishers are going to fish every day. Just last two things is about public policy. This week finally we start promoting a sustainable fisheries and aquaculture award in Mexico, and after 2 years and a half process, 9 voting process with senators, lower chamber, etc., finally is legal to celebrate good practices with an award in Mexico. It's a good thing and takes time. So now is the call for proposals at the national level. Excellent experience, but it's a process. And finally, my last point is we are inviting NGOs, researchers to please use the guidelines to evaluate your work. And also we want to start a platform so all other NGOs can put the results there. and fishers. Communities are already using the guidelines. Even though they don't know the guidelines, they are doing that. So the results are there. Our work is to systematize and to present that results. I think that is all.
Thank you, Jorge. Next up, we have Imani Morrison. She is the program officer of the Hope Foundation. You heard so much about Hope Foundation here. She has a specialization in regional planning from the West Indies, and she's a board member on several organizations, including, importantly, consultative group of biological diversity, and she's also on the chair of trustees of the University of Belize. Is that right? Used to be. Okay. Right. So.
Good morning. I want to thank the organizers for extending an invitation for us to be a part of the gathering. It's really an honor to be here. I'll start off by sharing a bit about Hope, because I presume you're all curious to know who we are if you're not familiar with us. We're a family charity headquartered in Geneva. Our trustees are alive and well. They're actively engaged in grant making. So they advise on, or they make decisions on grants that all relate to our mission. The organization's mission is we basically commit our resources to address issues of global, social, and environmental concerns, particularly those that relate to, or those that have major impacts on the most disadvantaged populations. So that is our charter. On an annual basis, we award about 300 grants, and we do that globally. The areas of investment span from human rights to housing and homelessness, child abuse prevention, and environmental issues. Under our environment banner, we support climate change issues, but we tackle root causes of the problems. And in marine space, we look at ocean plastics, industrial fisheries, and small-scale fisheries. So we've been doing grant making on fisheries issues for about 15 or 20 years now. Our work started off in pilot locations, Belize or Mesoamerica region, the Arctic region, and Europe. So the common fisheries policy process was with our support. Through learning, through these pilot initiatives, we've figured quite a lot. Our investments are geared towards empowering stakeholders who really should have a voice and have a stake. We're not an implementing foundation, so we don't actually do anything other than award grants to support not-for-profit groups who are working on these issues. And 2 years ago, we completed a strategic planning process for a refresh of our small-scale fisheries work. That strategic planning process benefited from participation of over 50 or so scientists, fishers, stakeholders globally from all continents to really give us guidance on the things that we should focus on for investments. The strategic pillars that we landed on, the areas that we decided we are going to focus our investments on, is agenda setting. So how do we set the agenda? How do we elevate this issue on the global stage? But more importantly, how do we ensure that a rights-based approach and governance in small-scale fisheries is better embraced and incorporated? So the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, if you will. How do we give life to that? For us, we imagine projects of a number of nature. So it could be initiatives like supporting the revision, the Hidden Harvest 2 report, helping communications around that, ensuring that it really has life and there is uptake of the stories, understanding of the issues, and there is perhaps a bit of better awareness of the plight and the opportunities for addressing better management and governance in small-scale fisheries. In setting the agenda, I think part of our experience is that we tend to focus on building capacity. We talk about capacity from NGO or fisher perspective, community perspective. But we've also seen where nation states themselves lack capacity. And with the change of political leadership, you often may land on a policy and only to see a reversal of it. So there is little durability of the work. So in setting the agenda and planning for exchange of experience, we'd encourage learning and exchange networks as well at a political level to help leaders to learn from their peers. And we're imagining supporting initiatives like one advocated for by a parliamentarian for a parliamentary group that works with unpacking and simplifying and helping parliamentarians to better understand the principles. And they're hearing that from their peers. They're not necessarily hearing it from an NGO or hearing it from some other player. So it's peer-to-peer learning and elevation of the issues. We also have as a major pillar shifting the funding flows, or really diving into what global funding is going into small-scale fisheries, what issues it's supporting, whether it be aid agency funding or it's philanthropic funding. How do we encourage more direct investment on governance issues, recognizing that for the most part, actors in the space, funding actors in the space, especially multilaterals or bilaterals, may perceive it to be a domestic issue. And so it's a bit intrusive to be stipulating revisiting of governance arrangement, which, let's be frank, it's about creating space for your citizens to actively engage, empowering them to have a voice, and even at times asserting and affirming legally those rights. So it's not just consultative empowerment we're thinking of. So recognizing that dynamics, we're hoping to directly engage some of the funding partners. This is perhaps one of our most challenging pillars. The question for, I guess, this research community is the extent to which we're thinking or anticipating the dynamics that new funders, such as China, will bring to the table, and how are we actively engaging them, and how are we ahead of the curve in providing guidance for uptake of the principles in the SSF guidelines. And on our end as philanthropy, we're beginning a process of coordinating or the creation of a funders network, if you will, around this issue. Not so much, well, to ensure that we're at first learning from each other, we're aware of the projects, we can spot opportunities for collaboration and enhanced impact on the ground, alignment of our investments, and perhaps to begin to think more strategically, collectively as a community. In terms of empowerment, which is our final pillar, we see that as absolutely crucial and perhaps the essence of who we believe we are as a foundation. We pride ourselves on empowering others, on really helping stakeholders to have agency, and that takes many forms. It was interesting to listen over the past few days on how that is perceived by many facets of the community here. So whether it's the political players who create processes, workshops, and meetings for stakeholders to attend, or if it's engaging in the global diplomatic space to ensure that the principles are incorporated. We see that as good, but we tend to support bottom-up efforts and really work with fishing organizations, network organizations, using innovative means of communication and worst case scenario, litigation if needs be, to challenge government adherence to basic principles and for human rights and social justice. So we have projects, for instance, we've supported the Mayas in southern Belize in litigating to assert their rights to mangrove forests, which is crucial for fisheries in the southern region. That fight is against oil concessions. Similarly, the Federation of Fishers, you heard from the Belize group, you heard from the Arctic group, most of it is fighting against threats that encroach on traditionally used areas, or to be engaged in national processes that ensure result in clearly demarcated regions that are earmarked for community-based fisheries. And capacity building can take, there is an interesting media tactic in Belize where they use novella. Most people know the soap opera. So there's actually a fisheries soap opera that unpacks these principles of the small-scale fisheries. And so you don't need to go village by village to get the message across. It's through storytelling, and the characters become, heroes in the fishing community, and they really, they really unravel and engage on, you name it, piracy issues, or the economics, or even drug use, difficult issues that fishing communities are faced with, and to help them to understand the principles and the important issues in the small-scale fishery. So we envisage techniques of that sort, innovative techniques that really can bring scale to adoption. So for us, we really look forward to receiving interesting applications. We really look forward to supporting institutions that are working with stakeholders on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Imani. Next, and not least, Dr. Fabio Hazen. He's a professor in the Federal Rural University of Pernambuco in Brazil. Fabio, I understand, is an engineer and marine technologist by training. But I think, I don't know him personally, but I've heard a lot about the efficient ways in which he conducts the FAO meetings which he chairs, including the COFI session or the technical consultation which guided the SSF guidelines. So over to you, Fabio.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be here, and thank you for the reference to the technical consultation that I had the privilege to chair. And I know we only have 5 to 7 minutes to talk about implementation of more than 100 paragraphs in the guidelines, so it's quite a challenge. Since I'm a professor from a university, I will try to convey the message, the perspective from academia. But before going to implementation, I would like very briefly to talk about the process of building these guidelines. I remember in one of my first speeches during the technical consultation, I highlighted the fact that the guidelines and building the guidelines was not about an economic sector, but it was not about making money, it was about making a living. The guidelines were about livelihoods, culture, and tradition, and I think that was well taken into account in the guidelines. And the result of the process, which in my view was the most transparent and participatory process in any international document that I have had the opportunity to participate. And the result of that 7 years negotiation pretty much is a very sound, comprehensive, dense, and complete document. And every time I turn to it, I'm very well surprised on how good this document is. And talking about implementation and bringing to the perspective of the academia, we have a specific chapter, which is chapter 11 on information, research, and communication. For instance, I will very briefly read just 2 paragraphs referring to that. 11.6 says that all parties should ensure that the knowledge, culture, traditions, and practices of small-scale fishing communities, including indigenous peoples, are recognized and, as appropriate, supported, and that they inform responsible local governance and sustainable development processes. In 11.9, we have states and other parties should, to the extent possible, ensure that funds are available for small-scale fishers research and collaborative and participatory data collection, analysis, and research should be encouraged. Research organizes capacity development to allow small-scale fishing communities to participate in research and in the utilization of research findings. Research priorities should be agreed upon through a consultative process focusing on the role of small-scale fishers in sustainable resource utilization, food security, and nutrition, poverty eradication, and equitable development, including also disaster risk management and climate change adaptation considerations. So just very briefly 2 examples on how we should implement these guidelines with regard to information research and communication. And in my view, the message is very clear. The way to implement the guidelines is by empowering fishing communities. And with empowerment comes responsibility, and I think this is one of the key messages that I would like to convey. When the fishing communities have the opportunity to really and actively participate in decision-making process, they become co-responsible for the decisions that are made. And one thing that I have learned in my 30 years professional career is that commitment is a much stronger word than enforcement when we try to implement conservation and management measures. So with regard to what lessons we should bring to the academia, to the universities, I think the main one is a lesson of humility. Science can't despise experience, and I think we can't emphasize that enough. Not only traditional knowledge should be taken into account, but should be one of the main drivers of science development, going hand in hand with academic science. Fishing communities should be empowered to generate the data on their own fisheries and to actively participate in the process of fisheries monitoring and assessment needed to guide management and conservation measures. This is the only way to ensure fishing community fully participate in the decision-making process, which is, in its turn, the only way to ensure that the conservation and management measures agreed upon are adequately implemented. I think that as scientists, we need to understand that we do not have to look for responses that are out there, because the response, they need to be built together with fishers and the fishing communities. We should therefore stop trying to collect information about fishers and fishing communities and start to collect information with them, and even more so by them. And I think this is a change of paradigm, it's a change of way of doing things, and it applies everywhere, even here in this meeting. For example, I think we should move into a meeting that has a much stronger and effective participation of fishing communities, for instance. As a scientist, I think we should abandon our ivory towers, where we have entrenched ourselves for so long, and walk hand in hand on the beach sand with fishers and with the fishing communities. bringing that to the case of Brazil, and trying to bring an example, and my time is already up. Quite unfortunately, the Brazilian system for collecting fisheries statistics has been pretty much dismantled, destroyed in the past 8-10 years, which is a disgrace in ways, and a disaster. Because if we don't have information, it means we can't have any kind of planning and management. But if it is a disaster in one way, it also is a great opportunity, because it provides us the chance now to rebuild this system through the fishing communities, having the fishing communities as the main drivers of the entire system of collecting data, and based on that data, on making decisions on their fisheries. So I think this is the message I would like to convey from the academia and also to the academia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio. I'm going to give this panel some work to do while we ask some questions, and I'm going to be elaborate on this, and I want the panel members to listen very carefully, because I want you to articulate in 1 or 2 sentences what you would say to your respective group that you represent. In my understanding, we have a representative of the academia, Fabio. We have research organization, PEP. We have national NGO, Jorge. We have support advocacy group, Sebastian. And we have the funding organization, Imani. So if you can reflect on this, just 1 or 2 sentences, not now, at the end. I will now open the discussion to the audience here. I think we can take 3 questions. We have time till 11:45. Okay, yes. I suggest the strategy would be to grab the mic. Don't raise your hand, grab the mic. Yeah. Please identify yourself.
My name is Lorna Spade. I'm very privileged to be here this morning. I work for a small NGO called Mwambao in Tanzania, based in Zanzibar. And I want to talk a little bit about the SSF guidelines. 2014, we work with coastal communities in coastal Tanzania, mostly about capacity building, but from a point of view of advocacy as well. In 2014...
Sorry, I'll give you a minute
okay,
if you're going to say something. If it's a question, fine. Yeah.
Okay. 2014, ICSF came to us and asked if we would like to help implement the guidelines on coastal Tanzania. And they gave some small funds for a workshop, and I looked at this word implementation, and I was very uncomfortable with it, really. Anyway, so we ended up running a workshop on awareness of the guidelines, and which was great. We had coastal communities, and we talked about what the guidelines meant. But at the end of the day, everybody went home, and I thought, well, what now? You know, are we implementing the guidelines? What are we doing? We talked about the guidelines and the principles, but I really came away with the impression that what we want to be talking about is adopting the guidelines, and adopting the guidelines at all levels. And I would like to suggest and maybe ask if there's a tool for measuring adoption of the guidelines at a national level, policy level. But I also like Jorge's suggestion that we measure ourselves as NGOs in adoption of the guidelines in our work. Thank you.
My name is Silvia Salas, Mexico. My question is about capacity building. In the last session, it was mentioned several times by government that they have been getting support by NGOs or foundations. So when we talk about capacity building, my question is, when we know that the communities have already been getting this empowerment and also the responsibility, as it was mentioned, and when it's time to go. So when they can really take the self-management within the community.
So when to come, when to go?
Exactly, especially because otherwise sometimes everything collapses once the organizations or the foundation or the money is not there.
Thank you. Yes? Anybody else grabbing the mic? Yeah.
Hi, Linda Benkin with Alaska Alumni and Fishermen's Association. This is a fascinating, thought-provoking panel, and my question would be, I see a real need for similar research to influence policy and increase understanding of the need of people in the Arctic, in the Bering Sea, and sort of the circumpolar regions to bring forward the kind of information you've talked about the importance of fish for nutrition and fish, the cultural values of participating in fishing, and also growing threats from things like oil development, exploration, mining, as the climate changes and opens new possibilities in that. And I just would love to hear who is working in those spaces in the North with this kind of research and research that could be used to implement the guidelines in the northern parts of the world.
Thank you. Yes? Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not going to introduce myself again because I was the panel speaker, so I guess you know. Thank you, the panelists, for very good remarks and discussions. My question is around the name itself. The guidelines are for sustainability of the small-scale fisheries, for food security, and for poverty alleviation. And these all are very critical responsibilities that need resources for them to be, realized. My question now to the panelists would be, how do you see yourselves playing a role towards influencing the policymakers, the governments, so that they have an inclusion of a budget towards implementation? Because without budget, all these talkings will just end in meetings like this. So I would like to understand, how do you see yourselves also playing a role towards influencing for allocation of budget towards the implementation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Mark Leopold from IAD. I'd just like to make a short suggestion to the panel following today's talks, which I found very relevant about the links between research and fisheries policy development and implementation. Since Monday, we have been saying that researchers should work closer to fishers, organizations, communities, governments. So this is obviously going to be very challenging for us as researchers. And I think that one way to try to achieve that would be through concrete action in the field, trying to address specific fishery-related questions. I think that by doing that, we will be able to strengthen learning, collective action towards co-management as a way to really contribute to the implementation of the SSF guidelines in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's it. The questions have dried up. Now we will address the panel. Would you like to answer these questions? I mean, there were, if you remember, the question of capacity building. I mean, we claim we are going to build capacity, and we are there all the time. But is there a time to come, and is there a time to withdraw? How do you create self-reliance in the communities? Jorge, would you like to say something about it?
Yes, we are exactly in that moment in the NGO, and I think the recommendation is to be as clear as possible with the community. While you are there, and then have a a clear process when you enter and when you are going to leave. And stop, because sometimes we start promises, and researchers and NGOs, we start promising so much things, and we are afraid to say no. And fishers, communities are not mature, and they will understand easily when you say, I'm going to start this is my program, and I leave in 5 years or 2 years. And it's fine. We have been kicked out from communities. And or we decide to have an exit because we don't have enough funds. And we are seeing that sometimes your effort literally go down, but then someone always in the community will move up that level. So we are hoping that at least when we are moving out after, our experience say that is, at least if you are going to start a project in a community, you have to have a compromise of 5 years. If you are going to be there for 1 year, better don't do it. So after that, we are hoping that when we are moving out, at least maintain the same success, if we are success, but it's, or increase. We're working the graphs. But it's fine that things going down, because if you are doing a good job, things will be going up. Don't be afraid of that. Of embrace failure. It's good.
Thank you, Jorge. There was another question about supporting research in the north, in the Arctic, and places like that. Would you have something to say on that, or not on capacity building, on research work which is relevant in Alaska and in Finland and Siberia and so on?
John, you know I can't answer that. But I guess I can say that what you were talking about, the role of research in drawing out the values of fish, the nutritional values of fish, the cultural values of fish, and using research, I guess, you know, sometimes we're going to have to talk to some economists and say the replacement cost if you lose those benefits is powerful language. And I think, I mean, I personally don't know who's working in that region, but the Hidden Harvest Initiative should be doing some cases there, and I think that's the opportunity to work with that initiative as a first step to getting some powerful numbers that talk about those different values that small-scale fisheries bring.
Let's also take the question on research and policy. I mean, you know, how do researchers go about influencing policy? I mean, Fabio, would you like?
Yeah, well, very quickly, I think the role of us scientists is, to the extent possible and in every occasion possible, try to emphasize to policymakers and to the government that co-management is the only possible management, and strengthen by emphasizing that, working towards strengthening the mechanisms and institutions that allow fishing communities to actively participate in the decision-making process. And that brings me back to the first question on the capacity building. I think we only can have a perennial and effective change in community when we go as far as to change the institutional structure of decision-making, allowing or having as a result of the work a real change in the institutional arrangement that would allow fishing communities to participate in the decision-making. And after that happens, then everything comes as a consequence of that, because once they have the opportunity to really participate in the decisions that will affect their own lives, they will have the responsibility to that. And by itself, this will mean the most important capacity building mindset.
Thanks. I also agree that co-management, participation in decision making, but probably unpacking, that word participation is quite problematic. So really looking critically at voice representation within decision making and reflecting on that critically. I think one of the questions from IRD about research and real engagement with co-management at local scales is critically important for the credibility of any other policy influence. I think it's also from a research perspective important to recognise that not all research needs to be at the community level for policy influence, and in fact I think it's necessary that there is research at different levels to look at institutional gaps, institutional problems, and one of those things raised as well by Eddie Trudith was budgets. And I can use a specific piece of research from the Pacific that Hugh Govan did to understand, well, what proportion of government budgets are allocated to coastal fisheries relative to other sectors. And I think that's an important way to say, well, actually, with this budget, are you actually committed to the small-scale fisheries guidelines? And using that as a prompt, I guess, to kind of question people's commitment and maybe to encourage further commitment. Yeah.
I was just going to add that notwithstanding where co-management arrangements are not in place yet, so obviously that's the ideal and you want to have some level of empowerment, but where it's not there yet, in my view it's important to ensure that the message and the stories are still elevated and mainstream within the society so that you transcend just your community and you get allies beyond your specific community. So you don't necessarily have to wait for that empowerment through some legal framework to assert and have agency as a part of the wider society. You should have strong links with media. You should build strong coalition with other communities and try to elevate your policy issue in the wider national discourse. So that would be a strong suggestion, that you don't always have to wait on research to affirm that co-management is the ideal and wait on the legal framework to do it. You really have to assert.
Something to say on the issue of budgets, how to influence budgets as a funder, and you talked about influencing parliamentarians. Is that one route?
That is precisely the initiative that I spoke of specifically is geared towards that. It's getting peers to engage directly so they understand that legislatively can be enabled, they understand the value, and in understanding the value, perhaps they can help us out as the negotiations take place for budget allocation in the country. But we found that the willingness to pay work, speaking in the language that helps actors to appreciate the value of the resource to communities vis-a-vis other sectors where it's, it might be the wealth would be concentrated in the hands of a few or exported. That narrative can ring through if you're able to kind of use research to make the case. And we had that in a number of campaigns that helped to show and weigh the pros and the cons of investment in one sector versus, like the oil and gas offshore versus fisheries and tourism and the employment benefits for a small nation state. It is important to influence and make a decision, and it's not always the budget, it's the avoidance of cost by disruptive action, because there is a cost to society that's profound and often hard to reverse. So you have to look at both sides of the coin.
Thank you. I would like to take the question on the budget, and then I will answer this question on the information adoption of the guidelines. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So when it comes to budget analysis, I would suggest that we need not confine only to fisheries. So we have to look at education, health, women's empowerment. There are so many other activities which are relevant in the context of implementing the guidelines. So therefore, we may try to broaden it. And one small hint can be the kind of the subsidies all the countries are notifying to WTO. I hear that it's a very comprehensive database which is not used much. So, and that gives some indicator of how much money is going into fisheries and for what kind of activities. And then in addition, maybe one can see national budget allocation through ministries and for the coastal areas, for the inland areas, wherever the fishing communities live. So I think some kind of methodology one can develop to make it more inclusive. And then when it comes to a tool for measuring the adoption of the guidelines, I would suggest that the National Plan of Action that we heard in previous panel discussion would be relevant. And we can also see what kind of legislation are coming up, what kind of changes are happening in legislation. So this is more the kind of a state state's commitment to the sector. And then along with that, we can also try to do some kind of analysis, some kind of surveys. Researchers can talk to fishing communities and see whether they themselves are aware of the guidelines through other processes, other kind of capacity building exercises. And then I think that would give a sufficient idea from the bottom end and from the top end about how far these guidelines are being adopted, and then that would help us to plan better about further awareness raising needs and capacity building needs.
Yeah, before the panel does their task, which again I want to remind you, I will give you a minute and you just give us the main message that you have for your sector. Okay. I would just like to say a few things about what has already been said. And I think some of the important issues that have come up is, as I understand it, is that influencing policy for small-scale fishery should not be confined to the fishery sector alone. I think we've done a lot of that for a long period of time. And we know that the fishery sector is not an important sector in most of our countries, in terms of contribution to the gross national product. I mean, it may be 1%, 2%, maybe 5 or 10, but it's really low. Therefore, the preference is always for some other resource from the sea. And fish is not the most valuable resource from the sea when you view it from the perspective of the decision makers. Therefore, policy making, if you restrict it to the sector, may have its limitations. And I think this idea that we have to approach this from other sectors too. And that's why the guidelines is important, that it is situated in the larger context of the community as a whole. So if there is social development, if there is proper educational capability building, if the living standards improve through other means, then the communities themselves can find alternatives. It's not necessary that everybody continues in this occupation. They can continue to have respect and regard and continue to keep the cultural concomitants of small-scale fisheries, but it doesn't mean that everybody has to continue in fishing. And if you want to have that, I think we need to broaden the policy influencing beyond the fishery sector. The other thing that was said here was that often there are policy voids, and this is very important. It's important to find what these policy voids are and to address them. And policy is not about fish. Yes, it is, but policy is primarily about people, and we should not forget that. And the guidelines again emphasizes the role, the centrality of the people in the sector and the people who represent the backbone of this sector. So I think, you know, that these three things are important, that we need to keep this in mind, and that this is what has come through this panel. So finally, let me go to the task. So let me ask the academician sitting at the end, Fabio, to tell us in 1 minute what is the message he has to the other academicians here.
I thought you had mentioned one sentence or two. So I just would say science can't do without experience. Scientists and fishers must work together to jointly find the responses needed to ensure the sustainable development of small-scale fisheries. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I'm going to borrow a little bit from Jorge. He was particularly wise, I thought, and that we can use the small-scale fisheries guidelines as researchers, but as NGOs as well, to reflect on how our research programs and principles are aligned to the small-scale fisheries guidelines as an ultimate goal, and just being honest that we're moving towards that, and being critical about where we're not. And in that reflection, making sure that can your reflection hold up to scrutiny as well.
From the perspective of the NGO, conservation NGO, national NGO?
I would say fishers, I think like already said, fishers go to fish every day. They are really flexible. They are adapting to changes. They can change gears, species, markets in days. So as NGO, we need to move way more faster. And as I said, less blah blah, more chop chop. And we are losing a huge opportunity. Everybody is doing research. We are doing research for NGOs promoting sustainability for 30 years. And there is a new generation of fishers coming. And we are doing something with all these papers and glossy reports to pass that information to that generation? Or in 20 years we will be complaining, oh, the fishers are not sustainable, blah, blah, blah. We need to start like using these guidelines. I know if they talk about the new generation. There is a program to present these guidelines to the schools. Fishers go to fish every day and they need income. So we are losing that. Sorry.
Thank you. Sebastian, to the advocacy and support groups.
I just would like to take two sentences. If you look at the root of the word fisheries, it has got two roots. One is about fishers in a place, and the other root is about fishing as an industry. So therefore, I think the guidelines provide a very good framework within which we can combine the two. And then to have full kind of plenitude of the guidelines to be realized, we need to target all relevant institutions, all relevant mechanisms and processes. In short, we have to target all governance institutions at national and international levels. And for that, there is a different need of capacity building required, because so far we have been more in a vertical line. So we have to now think of vertical and horizontal lines together. So therefore, what kind of capacity building we need to strategically move ahead, so that a marginalized sector represented by people who perhaps matter less than other industries in the world can decisively and effectively influence decision making at various levels. Thank you.
It's interesting, my comments are very similar. I would say to the community, how do we better coordinate to work collectively to support efforts that build capacity at multiple levels in order to create a movement which has a better chance of impacting on policy. So it's not just traditional capacity building, it's really impactful movement that can be felt.
Thank you. So, thanks to all the panel speakers for this wonderful session, and thanks to all of you who have listened and hopefully got some inspiration on how to influence policy. Thank you very much.
Many thanks from all of us. So just bear with us for another 10 minutes. There's some gifts, of course, for the speakers, because we do need to tell you about field trip tomorrow and also about Friday. So I could make the field trip talk very quickly, because the most important thing is about trying to talk about this. Emma, can you get that going from there?